Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a tiny farmer's cart. It's going to be selling vegetables with fruits and things like that, so I can include a lot of colors in this. This is based off a picture that I found and I really like the color as well as the shape of this cart, but I'm going to create my own version with a different angle which is much easier to draw. I'm going to draw this out in a straight front view and I just want to make sure I have the right size for the space that I have. So I start out by lightly sketching the basic shapes of the cart. This way I can erase and fix things without damaging my paper if I do need to erase multiple times. I also want to include some decorations around the cart, so I do want to make sure I also have enough space surrounding the cart as well. Once I'm more or less happy with the size and the placement of the cart, and if it's center enough for me, I'm going to start adding other features of the cart, and I'm also going to start imagining how I would display the items. I really like how they displayed the sunflowers hanging from the top of the cart, so I'm going to include some items like bananas, garlic, chilies, and things like that displayed in more or less a similar manner. I also want to think about how I would display the items on the counter as well as the surrounding area. And before I think about the actual items themselves, I want to create a setup for the baskets and things like that so I can figure out the composition and play of height of these crates and boxes. Once I'm done placing the displays, I'm going to fill them up with the produce. Of course, I'm just going to simplify the shapes by drawing circles and such for oranges or apples. This again is very rough and it's just to remind myself what sort of produce I'd like to include in this cart. Personally, this is enough to use as a guide for my painting, but for you who needs clearer ones, you can go further and clean your outline. And for those of you who would like to jump straight to painting, I'll leave the outline available in my coffee shop. Next, here are the colors that I'm going to be using. Firstly, this is Cobalt Green by Holbein, Crimson Lake by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Indigo by Schmincke, Vermilion by Holbein, Sepia by Holbein, Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, and I'll also be using Bleed Proof White by Dr. Paige Martins. Now let's begin to paint. The first thing I'm going to make is a green as well as a red mixture. So the first green is from a mix of indigo and Hansa Yellow Medium, and I'm going to use it to paint on some greeneries on top of the tomatoes that I'm going to paint. As for the red of the tomatoes, I'm using a thick consistency of vermilion, and as I'm painting, I want to leave out some white negative space so it looks nice and shiny. I'm using a really dry brush load here so you can see that my brush isn't puddling wet with paint. This way it's much easier to control the flow. For darker red, I added sepia into the vermilion and I'm going to paint in between the tomatoes so it looks like there are more underneath. For the next produce, I'm going to create leafy greens. I'm not sure what these are exactly, but I just drew them out because I had the shapes in mind. As for the green, I just added more indigo into the previous mixture to create more of a darker and deeper green. To make the leafy areas, I wiggle my brush around to create uneven, wavy edges, and I left out a white negative line in the middle of all the leaves. Once everything's completely dry, then I fill in the rest with the light green, which is the same mixture with more Hansa yellow. For the next one, I'm going to paint carrots. I started with the top of the carrots first using the light green mixture and I just painted on 3 lines. Then once it's completely dry, I used a mix of Hansa yellow and vermilion for the orange. It's best to use a light brush load when you're painting all of these small items, but if it's too difficult still, you can always use a smaller brush. Now for the rest of the space, I use the dark red mixture and the orange mixture and I just paint in between the carrots, just like what I did with tomatoes. At the back, I'm going to be painting some iceberg lettuce. Just like the leafy greens, I create wavy lines, but I left out some white negative space. And This time I also made it rounded. As for the color, I used the same light green mixture. Next, for these eggplants, I used a mix of Crimson Lake and a bit of indigo, and I just painted on ovals, but just like the previous produce, I left out some white negative space in between so I can fill it in with a darker value. And as for the darker value, I just added more indigo in the ratio. Once it's more or less dry, I'm going to top it off with a little bit of light green. After this, I'm going to paint the bananas. For this, I used a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium with Yellow Ochre to mute the yellow slightly. I just painted on these banana shapes while leaving a bit of negative space in between so the color won't run into each other. Then while the surface is still a touch damp, I added a little bit of light green at the bottom. I'm going to paint them in rows so it looks like they're freshly picked from the tree. Once I've painted enough rows, I'm going to use the green mixture to paint a stem that is visible from behind the bananas. For the hanging garlic bulbs, I just use the same mixture as the eggplant, but I use a really thin consistency this time. Moving on to the right hand side, I drew out some jars. You can fill it up with any color you'd like. I was just imagining that there were gems inside, so the colors that I picked is this pink, orange, and also yellow. I'm going to paint on some red on the basket on the right here, and as for the color, I used a mix of the dark red from Vermilion and Sepia, the banana mixture, and a little bit of light green to mute the color, and I just added more of the dark red for the darker value. Now moving back to the jar, once it's completely dry, I'm going to paint on the lid using yellow ochre mixed with the dark red. On top of the jar, I'm going to paint on some green bottles. This could be olive oil or something like that. I used the light green mixture for this with added yellow ochre to mute the green more. And for the lid, I used the same color as the lid of the jar. The previous produce should be completely dry by now, so I went back in to paint some darker values for the lettuce and also darkened some of the leafy greens. At the back there are larger jars. Again, you can choose any hues that you would like. I chose yellow ochre and a bit of the light green. And as for the lid, I used the exact same color as before. For the chilies on the right, I just used vermilion, and the shape is quite similar to the banana, but I'm making them all face downwards. When I'm painting the red, I also left out a little bit of space for the green stem. Now going back to the bananas, now that they're completely dry, I used the same color mixture. This probably has a bit more yellow ochre. I'm just going to separate them by painting lines in between and a little bit more at the bottom to help with the form. Now moving on to the plants, I'm going to create a chili plant because I find that the red will be a nice pop of color against the green. So I just used the same color as the chilies before from vermilion in a very thick consistency, and I just used the same green mixtures as before as well from Hansa Yellow and Indigo. On the right hand side, I'm going to add some flowers for more color. And for this, I used a mix of Crimson Lake with Indigo, and I'm using a very thin consistency. To pair this up, I'm using a light green this time so it doesn't blend too much with the previous plant. For this next one, I just painted on some circles using orange from a mix of Vermilion and Hansa Yellow. And since it's quite wet, I'm just going to leave it to dry and move on to the next plant where I painted more chilies. Since the paint was still a bit damp, I'm just going to move on to the smaller pots. I'm going to create different textures of leaves. For this one, I'm making them quite large using this dark green from the same mixture as before, but with a lot of indigo. And for this next one, I started out by painting single long strokes, and then I'm just going to add on the leaves on either side. For this next one, for a different green, I added some yellow ochre to mute the green slightly, and I just painted shorter strokes going in different directions. For this last one, I'm creating something similar to the first one again using that dark green mix. I'm going to lighten the green with a bit of yellow ochre, and I'm going to use this muted green to paint the leaves for the chili plant or the pepper plant. I'm thinking about larger leaves for this one, which is why I put a bit more pressure and I made the strokes a bit longer compared to this orange tree. As for the plant in the middle, I'm just going to treat it as a background, so I added Hansa yellow in the previous mix for an even lighter green, and I'm just going to place it behind the ones that I've already painted. I wasn't sure what to put in this container, so I decided to paint big wooden spoons and wooden forks. Now let's move on to the roof. I'm going to combine a few different colors for this, starting with a medium to thick consistency of Quin Sienna. And I want to switch it up by adding some sepia and also a bit of yellow ochre. And I'm just going to alternate them so the surface has a few different tones. You can also play around with the consistency where some areas are lighter than others. While I was painting this, I realized that I want to separate the top part of the roof and the area that I'm painting right now. So you'll see me not touching that area for now and using a slightly darker value when I'm painting the bottom to try to separate it. And once that top part is completely dry, I just line the bottom of the area using a slightly thicker consistency than the top. For the bottom of the roof visible from the back, I'm going to use the same color mixture, but I'm using a thicker consistency and a slightly darker value. This is from a mix of Quin Sienna and sepia. And for the wooden structure on top, I'm just going to use sepia in a medium consistency. Now for this same wooden structure that is front facing this time, I'm using sepia mixed with a little bit of purple to darken the tone. And I also added that Quin Sienna mix to warm the tone slightly. This time though, I used a light consistency to separate it from the back since there's a little bit more light coming from the front. And while the surface is still wet, I also used a slightly thicker consistency on top to create the shadow underneath the roof. Now still using the same color, I relined the top part of the roof, and I'm also using a medium consistency to add lines for the texture. I want the roof to have this rustic look, so I intentionally made the lines uneven so you can see some lines are thicker than others. And for the top of the roof, I applied the same thing but in a thinner consistency to keep the values separated from each other. Next, I'm going to start painting the baskets for the produce. I'm using this light brown mixture that is similar to a yellow ochre. I personally just have a lot of colors already on my palette, so I just pick up whatever is close to that tone. And this probably has a little bit of Quin Sienna as well as Vermilion mixed into it. I'm also going to use the same color to paint the crates as well as the wooden structure of the cart. Since the baskets are all painted with this one color, I need to separate it after the baskets are completely dry, and for this I used a mix of sepia and Quin Sienna, and I'm using a thick consistency to just add lines in between, and then a lighter consistency for the top and the bottom. I also added details to the baskets. You can also use a smaller brush for this, of course, or you can use colored pencils later on. Still using the same color in a medium consistency, I'm also going to add details to the crate on the right. You can see from my palette that I already have a lot of different browns, so I'm just going to add yellow ochre into this to create a slightly different tone, and this also thickens the consistency. I'm going to use this brown to paint the crate in front, as well as a thinner consistency to paint the front of the tabletop. As for the top part, I'm going to use a medium consistency since that area is in shade. Next, I'm going to paint the body of the cart. For this, I use cobalt green mixed into the muted yellow that I had on my palette, which probably has Hansa yellow as well as yellow ochre mixed into it, along with a tiny bit of other colors, which is why the color is slightly more muted. And I'm just going to paint this per section, starting from the outside of the cart using a medium to thin consistency. Then once it's more or less dry, I'm going to paint the other section. This part is slightly rounded, so while I'm painting this, I'm also going to leave out a tiny bit of white negative space for the highlights around the curvy areas. To separate those two areas further, I'm going to use a thick consistency of the same mix just to outline this section, and I'm also going to use the same color to paint underneath the tabletop, as I want the tabletop to look like it's slightly protruding outwards more than the cart. As for the space between the cart and the wheel, I'm just going to use sepia, so it looks like a dark shadow. The load on my brush was a bit too heavy, so the color ended up being quite watery, so I'm going to go over it again using a thick consistency. I want to add a little detail to the wheels, so I'm just using the same color as the cart. I'm going to wait for that whole area to dry. Meanwhile, I'm going to paint the crate behind the pots, and for this I just use the same mixture as before. And I'm going to use a darker brown to paint the stand on the right underneath the large crate. On the left, I'm going to paint on the same details as the previous crates by lining the top and the bottom, and in between I'm just going to paint lots of vertical lines. The going back and forth might be a little bit confusing to watch, but this is a good use of time considering you can wait for that part to dry and work on other places, then go back to it once it is workable again. I want the pots to be simple terracotta pots, and as for the color, I'm just going to use a mix between yellow ochre, Quin Sienna, as well as sepia, and play around with the ratio to create different tones, but more or less they're going to be these orange brown or a more reddish brown. Okay, next I'm going to be painting the wheel, and for this I want it to be more of a bluish gray, so I used a mix of indigo with a little bit of sepia to neutralize the color. And here I'm starting with a light to medium consistency to just cover that whole area. And I also left out a tiny bit of negative space for highlight to make this look a little bit more plump and cartoony. While the surface is still a tiny bit damp, I'm going to use a thicker consistency to paint a little bit more of the center, so it looks like the wheel is sunken a little bit in that section, and I also added a tiny bit of line detail. After looking at all the plants, I feel like they need a little bit more of a darker value since they're painted quite flatly in one layer. So here I'm just going back in with a green that I already had on my palette and just painted on some dots for extra texture. I also want to add a tiny bit of shadow underneath the plants using the same terracotta mix. This probably has a little bit more sepia though for a slightly darker value. For the center of the wheel, I'm going to color it using the same gray. This is from indigo and a little bit of sepia, but in a lighter consistency than the wheel. Since I've painted all of the elements so far, I'm going to add a shadow as well as the color of the ground. For this, I used a mix of indigo and sepia with yellow ochre, and I'm starting with a light to medium consistency, painting underneath the cart as well as the crates and the pots. Once I reach further down the composition, I'm using an even lighter consistency and just adding water in between until my bristles run out of paint, and I'm just going to let it run with a dry brush texture. Then while the surface is still a little bit damp, I'm going to go back in using a slightly thicker consistency but still fairly light to enhance the darker values of the cast shadows. This wasn't part of the composition, but I felt like adding more bright plants, so I'm just going to freehand some here using a bright green mixture. And while the surface is still damp, I'm going to dot in a slightly darker value for extra texture, but I'm going to leave this one fairly loose. Since I've painted the shadow underneath the plant, I also want to add the shadow on the plant, so I'm going back in with the same mixtures before with Hansa yellow and indigo, and sometimes a bit of yellow ochre to mute the green slightly. The ground seems a little bit too dry for me, so I'm going to add more greeneries in front of the crate, and at the back I also decided to add a tree for the background. For this, I just use the browns that I already had on my palette. You can use a darker or a light brown, it's completely up to you. And I decided to pick up a light green that I also already had on my palette, using a very light consistency to paint the greenery on the tree. I do want to make sure that this is painted very light compared to the rest of the features, so this stays as a background. At this point, I'm fairly happy with all the features, so I'm going to erase any pencil outlines that I can still see, so I can add the additional outline, detail, and texture using my colored pencil. For certain elements like the garlic here, I didn't really paint any detail since it was too small, so this is when I can add on the extra texture and detail using my colored pencil. I'm also going to do this to add texture to baskets and things like that. Since all of the elements are fairly small, you do want to make sure that you have a sharp pencil. If you're using the same brand that I'm using, since this is a hobby grade, it's not very pigmented, so it really helps to have a really sharp tip. After adding on some definition with the outlines, I felt like I need to add some highlights as well, especially to the fresh produce like the eggplants and the chili. So I just used bleed proof white for it. I also decided to add a little signage on top. I just find that adding a little bit of text would be really cute to the composition, but it's completely optional. To make sure the text and the lines are clean, I just use a pen for it. It's my waterproof Sakura Micron pen, and it's in the color Sepia, so it stays within the same tone as the pencil outline. After this, I'm just going to add some extra highlights using a light consistency of bleed proof white for some of the texture of the roof. And that's basically it for this painting. It's quite a small one, so please take care with the brush load if you decide to paint this at the exact same scale. If you're new here and found this tutorial useful, feel free to subscribe and get notified of new tutorials that I post every Friday. The list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!